try to give you insights on their experience in Italy. Because normally when we speak about Mary Shelley especially, we always think about Frankenstein, that is her first novel. But what people sometimes overlook is the fact that Mary Shelley wrote many other works, and most of them actually revolved around her Italian experience or experiences. Because as I will show you, Mary Shelley went to Italy 3 times. The first time with Percy, and the other 2 times she went to Italy with her son Percy Florence. So, as I mentioned, she wrote 2 novels, 2 more novels revolving around the Italian themes, and 10 out of her 23 short stories are set in Italy. She also wrote a travelogue in the last part of her life concerning her Italian voyage and her Italian experience, and she also wrote some critical essays revolving around Italy. As far as Percy Shelley is concerned, we all know that Italy was important to him because he wrote, for example, Prometheus Unbound, The Cenci, which is a play on an Italian theme, and also Swellfoot the Tyrant. He wrote these 3 plays in the years between 1819 and 1820. So he was not just involved in whatever happened in the UK, because we know that, for example, in 1819, he wrote The Mask of Anarchy concerning Peterloo Massacre, but he also wrote stories connected with his Italian experience. But let's first of all go slightly backwards and see why people used to go to Italy. Because it's not just Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley. There is a very long tradition of travelers coming from the upper class that used to go to France and Italy on their grand tour. And I am sure you're all familiar with that. The Grand Tour was some kind of educational travel that, you know, the young people coming from the middle and upper class used to do to complete their education. Because in Italy, especially, they would be confronted with the arts, the antiquities. They would learn the real thing, not just what they studied on books. So it was very, very popular as a destination for travelers, not just tourists. Tourism in Italy will start slightly later, in the second half of the 19th century, mass tourism. So until the first half of the 19th century, we are talking about a special kind of travelers, those that wanted to complete their education. Some people also chose Italy for different reasons. Italy was inexpensive if compared to the UK, for example. So many people who were used to a very wealthy standard of living, and that for some reasons had some financial problems, used to move to Italy. And financial reasons is one of the causes that prompted Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley to go to Italy. There is also another reason that always makes my students laugh. In Italy, everything that was not allowed in the UK was allowed. So Italy was the land of the illicit. If you think, for example, of Lord Byron, and you know all about Lord Byron's standard of living, his way of life that was absolutely beyond any rules, when he self-exiled himself because his relationship with his stepsister was, was found out, he decided to move to Italy. And in Italy, he led eventually the life that he had always wanted to lead. So a life of excess, a life of self-indulgence, a life of pleasure. We know that, for example, he used to say that in Venice, especially during the carnival, he used to meet a lot of women and also men, and then he used to confess because he approached also Catholicism when he was in Italy. He used to confess, and he absolutely enjoyed confessions because he could sin and then clean his soul and then sin again. So Italy was considered as a very good way of leading the life that each of them wanted. As far as Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley are concerned, they decided to go to Italy for several reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, financial reasons, because, I mean, the standard of living that you could have in Italy was not comparable to the standard of living you could have in the UK. With the same amount of money, you could live in a mansion, you could have your own horses, you could have a stable, you could have everything you wanted for little money, because Italy was and still is inexpensive if compared to the UK standards. Then there were other reasons. Percy Shelley was always convinced that he was sick. This is one of his many peculiarities. He was convinced that he had tuberculosis, but he didn't. He was perfectly healthy. So we know that he died in a shipwreck. So he didn't die of tuberculosis like John Keats, for example. But he was convinced that in Italy, with a milder climate, he would have a better life. So this is another reason that prompted them to move. But then there was another reason which involved his previous marriage. We know that before marrying Mary Shelley, he had already tied the knot with Harriet Westbrook, and he had had 2 children with her, Charles and Ianthe. Harriet Westbrook had committed suicide. Probably it was rumored that she was pregnant, but Percy Shelley obviously was not the father of the child, so she drowned herself. And the custody of the 2 children was taken from Percy Shelley because Percy Shelley was not considered to be a suitable father to bring up 2 children. So he was afraid that also the children he had had with Mary Shelley would be taken from him, which is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous preoccupation because Mary Shelley was alive, so the children had their mother, regardless of their father figure. But I mean, this mixture of concerns and opportunities prompted the 2 Shelleys to go to Italy on the 30th of March, 1818. And Percy Shelley would, finish his days in Italy. And Mary Shelley would live in Italy 1 more year after the death of Percy Shelley. Eventually, she would leave Italy, but just for financial reasons. Because we know that Sir Timothy, Percy Shelley's father, basically blackmailed her. And he told her, unless you come back, I will not grant any allowance to your son. Because we know that Percy Florence, the only surviving sons of the Shelleys, was born in Florence during their Italian stay, after both Clara Everina and William died. Because the 2 children that traveled with them from the UK to Italy died in Italy. And for Mary Shelley was a terrible, terrible loss. So let's see, first of all, what kind of travel, what kind of itinerary the 2 Shelleys shared in Italy. Obviously, they visited the most important cities, especially in the north of Italy. They visited Turin, Milan, Genoa, Venice. They spent a lot of time in Venice, and actually Clara Everina died in Venice. Then they went further south. They went to Tuscany. Tuscany was full of British, so they had their own little enclaves. It was like little London, you know, I mean, it was like living in England, because there were so many British there that the official language in this little enclaves was English. So they went to Florence, Leghorn, Pisa, and then they spent 2 periods of time in Rome. First of all, in November 1818, then they went further south. They went to Naples, but Naples is the furthest they went. And then they went back to Rome, where they spent a long period until June, the beginning of June 1819, and they left Rome to go back to Tuscany when William died of malaria. So that was a terrible loss for Mary Shelley. I mentioned Naples as the further south city where they went. Why? Because it was widely believed that, first of all, Naples was a very dangerous city. And Naples was a very dangerous city and still is quite a dangerous city. So there are some areas of Naples where it's better not to go even now, because you might not come, I wouldn't say alive, but at least your money will go for sure. But the south, the very south of Italy, was considered to be a land of banditti, of outlaws, of dangers, and they were right. It was quite dangerous, and very, very few travelers ventured to the south of Italy. Very, very few. The only one who went south, but for different reasons, is Coleridge. We know that Coleridge was posted in Malta, and from Malta he went to Sicily. So he didn't travel through Italy, but from Malta he went to Sicily, from island to island. But as I always tell my students, there is a very good reasons for Coleridge to go to Sicily, because the opium that was cultivated in Italy was the best, according to Coleridge. So it's not for the antiquities, it's not for the scenery, it's not for the natural beauties that he went to Italy, but to smoke. So this is not a very noble reason, but for Coleridge it was a very good one. So Naples was the further south city where they went. Now, what kind of life they led? Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley were different from all the other travelers, because I mentioned the cities that they visited, but they didn't visit cities only. They also visited small villages. They ventured off the beaten track. And this is very important, because they wanted to have a real relationship with people. They wanted to talk with people. They learned Italian. Percy Shelley already knew Italian. Mary Shelley was not very proficient, but she improved her Italian dramatically when she was in Italy, because they associated themselves mostly with Italian people, with Italian intellectuals. For example, in Rome, they were very fond of an archaeologist, Marianna Candidi Dionigi, who was actually their next door neighbors when they lived off Via del Corso in Rome. So they tried to mix and mingle with the normal people. They enjoyed the opera, so they went to the theater and to the opera houses all the time, but they also enjoyed what was called the improvvisazione. What is improvvisazione? Improvvisatori were kind of spontaneous poets. And one of them became a very good friend of the Shelleys. His name was Tommaso Sgricci. Let's, for example, think of how an improvvisatore worked. I give you a subject. The subject could be, I don't know, a waterfall. And then the improvisatore would improvise lines on a waterfall like that, out of the blue, without thinking. And Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley were really, really astonished by this improvisatore, because to them, this was something inconceivable. They were used to thinking of poetry as labor, as something that you have to ponder on and you have to work on, whereas the Italian improvisatori just produced beautiful poetry like that. It was just a natural gift. But Percy Shelley was a bit skeptical. Mary Shelley was fond of them. Percy Shelley was skeptical, and he used to say, oh, this is because Italian people are very lazy and they don't want to work on their poetry, so they just improvise, but their poetry, after all, is lost. And this is true, because the poetry of the improvisatori was oral poetry. And therefore, you know, after it was uttered, it was gone completely for life. Okay, so this element introduces a fracture between the Shelleys, because Mary Shelley was absolutely fond of Italy and the Italians, whereas Percy Shelley was fond of Italy, was fond of the natural landscape, was fond of the antiquities, but he was not fond of the Italians. His dream was Italy without the Italians. Like, you know, that was the dream of many English travelers that used to go to Italy. They didn't want the Italians. The Italians were dirty. The Italians were peasants. They were not refined. And Italy was so beautiful that it would have been much better to remove all the Italians and to people Italy with British people who could appreciate, really appreciate the natural landscape. This is a very racist perception, but it was really widespread. And I'm going to quote now from a letter that Percy Shelley wrote from Naples in 1818 to his friend Thomas Love Peacock. And this will clarify exactly what Percy Shelley thought of Italy and the Italians. I'm going to read it for you. There are two Italies, one composed of the green earth and the transparent sea and the mighty ruins of ancient times and aerial mountains and the warm and radiant atmosphere which is interfused through all things. The other consists of the Italians of the present day, their works and ways. The one is the most sublime and lovely contemplation that can be conceived by the imagination of man. The other is the most degraded, disgusting, and odious. So as you can see, there was a huge difference between his opinion on Italy and his opinion on the Italians. And he further elaborated on this in other lectures that he wrote. Always to Thomas Love Peacock, for example, he used to complain about Lord Byron, because in his view, Lord Byron was too Italianato. So he had acquired too much of the Italian way of life, and he associated himself too much with vulgar Italians. And there are very, very funny passages that I always read to my students, and I really laugh. And I'm going to share one with you. Well, Lord Byron is familiar with the lowest sort of these women, so Italian women. The people his gondolieri pick up in the streets. He associates with wretches who seem almost to have lost the gait and physiognomy of men, and who do not scruple to avow practices which are not only not named, but I believe seldom even conceived in England. So the Italians were immoral compared to the British. And as far as the women were concerned, to him, Italian women stank because they ate too much garlic. And therefore, you couldn't go near them because don't go near these women, they stink too much. And he wondered, how is it possible that Lord Byron even associates with them? We know that Lord Byron had a relationship with the Contessa Teresa Guiccioli, and I simply couldn't imagine to touch a woman like that because she stunk of garlic. He continued to elaborate on this fact that Italian people were somehow subhuman. And you find it in many, many letters, which are really racist. And this is something that astonished me when I first came across these letters, because when I think of Percy Shelley, I always think of a man who championed freedom and equal rights for everybody, but in the North, in the global North. Because in the global South, he regarded the people as inferior. And this was his opinion of the Italians. Actually, when he died, he dreamt of going back to England. In one of the last letters that he wrote, and he wrote this letter always to Thomas Love Peacock, he said, and I'm quoting it, "How that I could return to England, how heavy a way when misfortune is added to exile and solitude, as if the measure were not full. Heaped high on both, how that I could return to England." So he was not happy in Italy. He was happy for the landscape, he was happy for the antiquities, but he was not happy with the association that he had with the Italian people. And we can see that, for example, in one of the places that I mentioned before, which is the Cenci. The Cenci, actually, I don't know whether you're familiar with that, and if you are not, I strongly advise you to read this play. This is a play that he actually wanted to stage. It's not a play just to be written and read. He wanted to stage the Cenci. And the Cenci captures another aspect that is typical of the relationship between Shelley and Italy. His very, very strong anti-Catholicism. He used to portray Catholicism as, and I am quoting now from an unfinished short story entitled The Colosseum, Catholicism was the worst religion in the world. Percy Shelley used to see in the Catholic God a sort of tyrant, and we know that Percy Shelley fought all his life against tyrants. So in the Cenci, he actually manipulated the source and the real story of the family of the Cenci. Now, let me tell you, the Cenci is a real story, is a real episode connected to the life of Beatrice Cenci, who was a girl who lived at the end of the 16th century. And this girl actually killed her father, but because her father was abusive. He was rumored also that he had raped her. So she killed her father out of self-defense. But she was sentenced, and then she was beheaded in Castel Sant'Angelo. And there is a very, very famous painting of Beatrice Cenci, and I am really sure that you are all familiar with that, and if you're not, go and have a look at it. There's a beautiful painting by Guido Reni, or supposedly by Guido Reni. In actual fact, it was the painting was by Elisabetta Sirani. And in this painting, there was this beautiful lady that was, looking outside as if she was staring at the person staring at the painting. And supposedly this painting was made just before she was beheaded. And in this painting, she is like a saint, she's like a martyr. And she's supposed to be a martyr of an unjust system because she was just defending herself from her father's violence. And Percy Shelley got really moved by the story of the Cenci. He really loved this story and he really loved the painting. I'm going to give you another example of this love, and I'm going to tell you an anecdote connected with the painting, but I will do it later. Let me talk about the story first. So Percy Shelley decided to use the story of Beatrice Cenci, but instead of sticking to the sources, he manipulated the sources to highlight the horror that he felt towards Catholicism. In the real story, Count Cenci, the rapist, the horrible man, was also blasphemous. He was an atheist, okay? In Percy Shelley's story, instead, he is deeply Catholic, and he tells us that he could commit any crime he wanted because after he committed a crime, he used to pay the church, and then all his sins were gone, were banished, and he could sin again. So Percy Shelley used the story of the change, he manipulated it to express his own harsh feeling towards Catholicism as a form of tyranny. Let's go back to the painting. We all know that the features that we have, that we know correspond to Percy Shelley, are taken from one painting made by Amelia Curran, who was an Irish painter based in Rome and a friend of the Shelleys. So from that painting on, we know the features of Percy Shelley. So all the prints, all the successive paintings that we have, they're all based on that one painting by Amelia Curran. What most people don't know is that Percy Shelley made a request to Amelia Curran. And he said, please, Amelia, don't simply paint my face, but just join my features with the features of Beatrice Cenci. So I ask you, when this lecture is finished, I ask you to go and have a look at Beatrice Cenci's portrait, and then have a look at Percy Shelley's portrait, and you will see that the two paintings match in many respects, especially the eyes, because Percy Shelley identified himself with Beatrice Cenci. He himself regarded his relationship with his father as a very abusive one. We know that he hated Sir Timothy, and we know that Sir Timothy didn't love his son. He was ashamed of his son, who was a rebel. So he somehow projected himself onto Beatrice Cenci and her relationship with her father. So this is very interesting. So he bonded very much with this figure of martyr that was crushed by a tyrant. Let's go now to Mary Shelley. Let's talk about Mary Shelley. Now, as I told you, Mary Shelley spent not just the time with Percy in Italy, but she went back to Italy 2 more times, in 1840 and then in 1842 and 1843. So she spent a lot of time in Italy. You all know, for example, that she wrote also some letters completely in Italian, She was fond of Italy and the Italians. And when she had to go back to the UK, because, as I told you, Sir Timothy told her that otherwise he would have not granted any money for her son, she described herself in her letters as an exile. So, Percy Shelley felt an exile when he was in Italy. Mary Shelley felt as if she was an exiled when she went back to the UK. So her heart was in Italy, and she considered herself as uprooted in the UK. When she went back to England, she also associated with Italian refugees because we know that the political situation in Italy was really troublesome, and therefore there were a lot of Italian people that had moved to England. A very important example is one of the most important Italian poets, Ugo Foscolo. Ugo Foscolo actually died in England. So there were a lot of Italians in England that were fleeing from political persecution, and she associated with them. One of her best friends was a half-breed, half-Italian. His name was Vincent Novello. His father was Italian, his mother was English, and he was a musician. He was a composer, and he was also an improvisatore. So she continued to recreate somehow a little Italy outside in England. Okay, because she was so fond of Italy that she wanted to reproduce Italy also when she was in the UK. And we know that Mary Shelley was a self-supporting writer. So she had to live out of the sales of her works. Well, the reason why she wrote so many novels and short stories, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, concerning Italy, stems from the fact that she became an authority. She was an authorial voice on Italy. She was well informed, she had lived in Italy, she knew Italian, she knew the Italian intellectuals, and therefore she was reliable as a source. That's why she somehow constructed herself as a writer, as a professional writer around Italy. I'm sure you're all familiar with Frankenstein. Think of the introduction of Frankenstein. In the introduction of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley is always very hesitant. She says, oh, I'm not good enough. I tried to write a story, but I couldn't. I tried to compose a story, and Percy Shelley was asking me, have you finished your story? Have you finished your story? So she's very hesitant as a writer when she writes Frankenstein. When she writes on Italy, she becomes authoritative. So Italy somehow is her passport to become a professional writer. And we know that she wrote a really bulky and very informative novel entitled Valperga on the Italian political situation in the 13th century at the time of Dante. And I advise you also to read that novel. And she also wrote another novel which revolves around Italy, which is The Last Man, that she published in 1826. And The Last Man is a particularly interesting novel in this time, because it is a novel set in the future. It is set in 2073, and it speaks about a pandemic situation, the same that we are facing at the moment. So it is really, striking that she wrote something like that. And this kind of epidemics kills just men, while nature blooms, animals thrive. So it's really insightful, and I advise you to use this novel with your students, and I am sure that they will relate to that immensely. My students are relating to that immensely. Okay. So she also tried to somehow rehabilitate the image that the British had of the Italians. So as I mentioned to you, she wrote a couple of critical essays that aimed at criticizing British travelers, because British travelers just observed the surface of phenomena. They stopped at the surface of Italy. And these two critical essays are entitled Recollections of Italy, and this was published in 1824 on London Magazine. And then she wrote The English in Italy, published in 1826 in Westminster Review. In both critical essays, as I told you, she criticized with very much humor and irony. She criticized the British tourist, because she said, okay, you don't go to Italy to really see Italy. You go to Italy just to be able to tell your compatriots that you have been to Italy, that you visited Italy. So you didn't really want to mingle with Italian people. You just wanted to show off. You just wanted to say that you had visited the fashionable place. And unfortunately, this is real for many students, sorry, for many travelers, not just to Italy, but I think to India, to everywhere in the world. People just look at the surface of phenomena. You know, and she used to criticize the British because they had what she called the stay-at-homativeness syndrome. That is, they traveled just with their bodies, but their mind was back home. So their mind was not open. They did not really embrace difference. They just wanted to criticize whatever was different in order to feel that they were superior. Okay, so she criticized her compatriots. And she also jotted down the archetype, the prototype of a real traveler that is not a tourist. This real traveler she called Anglo-Italian. So for her, the epitome of the Anglo-Italian was Lord Byron, because he mixed with Italians. He knew Italian. He wanted to go deep into the Italian situation. Also the Italian political situation. We know that Lord Byron embraced the Italian cause of liberation, and so did Mary Shelley. So she regarded this Anglo-Italian as a model everybody should look up to. And she herself considered herself an Anglo-Italian. And for example, she wrote some articles for the Westminster Review, some anonymous reviews, and well, they were not really anonymous because she signed herself Anglo-Italicus. Okay, so we know that these reviews are by Mary Shelley, but she signed herself Anglo-Italicus because she wanted to mix what she thought were her two, the two parts of her heart. She felt British, but she also felt Italian. And I would like to devote the last 5 to 10 minutes of this lecture to the travelogue that she wrote regarding Italy, which is extremely interesting and underrated and overlooked by many scholars. Basically, after Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, most scholars have overlooked all the rest of her output, which is incredibly interesting. So you should look at this text that I'm quoting to you. So we know that according to the doctrine of the separate spheres, which is Victorian, but Mary Shelley also lived in the Victorian time because she died in 1851, and the Victorian era starts in 37, as we all know. We know that in the Victorian time, women were not supposed to write. And they were not supposed to delve into subjects that were the domain of men. And politics, the political situation, was a men-only subject. Okay? So Mary Shelley wanted to express her views on the Italian political situation. But obviously, she also was a self-supportive writer. So she needed to sell her books. She needed to increase the volume of the sales. Therefore, she created a travelogue that can appeal to many readers, because this travelogue that she published in 1844, which is entitled Rambles to Germany and Italy in 1840, 1842, 1843, because she also traveled briefly to Germany for health reasons, because she was already sick. She was already, I mean, she had a tumor, as we know, she had a brain tumor, probably a benign brain tumor. But she tried to recover her health in Germany, in the German spas. But she also went to Italy. So in this travelogue, she described the beauties of nature. She described many, 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 many works of art. This is incredible because she creates what I would call word paintings. She describes all the paintings, all the statues, all the antiquities that she sees with incredible amount of details, so that anybody that could read the travelogue could, you know, picture in his or her brain whatever she was describing. So it was like a virtual tour of Italy. So it was very informative in this respect. And it was written in the form of letters. And this is also very important. Women could write letters. Letters were familiar, letters were intimate. So by writing letters, she could somehow hide deeper messages. And this is exactly what she does, because in her novel, it's not a novel, in her travelogue, she embeds a lot of political innuendos. She criticizes very much the Emperor of Austria, for example. The Emperor of Austria that was suffocating, in her view, not just the bodies, but most of all the minds of the Italians. There is a very, very important thesis that she clarifies in this travelogue. In her view, the real domination of Italy was not a physical domination, because physical domination can be removed. You can rebel. What is more difficult to remove is a mental domination. And this mental domination was performed through what she calls the cultural starvation of the Italians. So Italian people were not encouraged to study, to read, even to know their own history. Because if they were not cultured, if they were not capable of thinking independently, then they could be manipulated. And this is particularly true of Italy, but I think it is particularly true of any country. Whenever culture is suffocated, then people can be maneuvered by tyrants. And this is also what is happening in Italy at the moment. And I'm not afraid of stating that. You know, in Italy, for example, at the moment, they're cutting all the funds on education, on universities, on schools. They're encouraging private schools, but this is because very few people can afford private education. So whenever a country does not invest in culture, then there is a huge problem. And Mary Shelley highlighted that. And she said, when the Italian people will recover pride in their roots, in their culture, in their traditions, then they will be able to acquire an identity, and then a political identity. And this is important. This is very important, because for her, she criticized, for example, the Carboneria. We know that Lord Byron instead embraced the Carboneria. He was a Carbonaro. Teresa Guiccioli was a relation with Pietro Gamba, and we know that Byron participated in these active and violent riots. Mary Shelley was against violence. In her view, violence was not the answer, was not the solution for the Italian people. The solution for the Italian people was thinking independently through culture. And this is the reason why in Rambles in Germany and Italy, she devotes ample sections of the travelogue to Italian writers, to the importance of Italian writers, especially Manzoni. Manzoni was a contemporary writer. Mary Shelley was very fond of Manzoni. She even attempted the British translation of the most important work by Manzoni, which is The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi. And she liked Manzoni because Manzoni wrote an historical novel set in the 17th century, but by describing the dominations in the 17th century, he was actually describing the current domination of Italy. So he was using some kind of double perspective, the past to reflect on the present. And this is exactly what Mary Shelley fostered. Read your novels, read your past, know your literature, know the thoughts of those who made Italy great, and then Italy will be great again. And Italian people will be able to remove the yoke of the tyrant. And I would like to conclude with a sentence taken from Rambles in Germany and Italy, which is extremely insightful. The time must come when again the Italians will take a high place among nations. Their habits, fostered by their governments, alone are degraded and degrading. Alter these, and the country of Dante and Michelangelo and Raphael still exist. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, very much. And if you see the chat box, it's filled with the praises.
No, I haven't seen the chat box. No,
it's filled with praises and lots of, I would say, I would like to inform you that our Indian Academia has text by Shelley and both the Shelleys in graduation as well as post-graduation. So there's a lot of Shelley in our Academia.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And this is an icing on the cake, your lecture. And I would confess the fact that I myself teach Shelley, PB Shelley, to my postgraduate students, and there are a lot of new informations and angles that you have provided, which definitely will add to my teaching. So this is not only an icing on the cake for teachers like me. There are a lot of teachers in this lecture, and I would also like to remind, mention to you that we have 275 participants who are listening to you.
Wow.
And,
275.
Yeah, 275, and still now there are 245 with us. after you have completed your lecture,
Fantastic.
because you know, as I informed you in the Gnosis lecture series, our emphasis is on the discussion as well, because you know, our intention is through discussions to encourage a lot of new upcoming budding scholars as well as academicians to explore new areas of research in a particular topic that our resource person is speaking on. And I'm
Wonderful.
sure whatever you have spoken today, a lot of new areas can be explored, and you will definitely play a pivotal role in that. People can contact you. You are very easily accessible and you are very
Yes.
cooperative. And I think you also sleep less like me as I do, because till late night yesterday, late night in India, I had a chat with you. You were awake and again you were awake. So we sleep less.
I'm an early morning person. At the moment it's 8 o'clock, 8:30 in Italy.
Oh my God.
But
After you
I
have
was up
finished.
at 6. No
Thank you very
problem.
much. Plethora of congratulations and insightful talk. And the most important thing is, a lot of teachers are commenting that, you know, this is a new insight, new insightful
I'm
lecture.
glad.
And yes, there are some very interesting questions.
Yeah. Yeah, if I don't know, shall I read
No. I will read the questions.
Okay,
And
okay, yes.
if you feel, you can choose to answer.
No, you choose the.
Dr. Gunjan Chaturvedi is an assistant professor in India, and her question is: will it be right to call The Last Man by Mary Shelley an apocalyptic dystopian science fiction?
Okay, no, and I will tell you why. Normally, scholars label The Last Man like that. Okay, apocalyptic, dystopian, and so on and so forth. But they forget the fact that The Last Man is framed within a frame narrative. And in this frame narrative, there are two narrators who actually discover some Sibylline leaves in the cave of the Sibyl in Naples. So this is set in Italy. And through these Sibylline leaves, they decode the story of The Last Man. So it is a prophecy. Mary Shelley didn't want to imply that the future would be like that. But the future could be that if we insisted on exploiting nature. It's a very eco-critical novel, yes, for sure. Because she wanted to highlight the fact that if colonialism continued, because the epidemic starts in Constantinople and comes from the east to the west, but just because she connects it with the colonial enterprise. So if colonialism continued, if exploitation of nature continued, if disregard for nature continued, then the future would be this. So I would not consider it apocalyptic, but I would consider it as a cautionary tale, as an educational tale. So look at this. This is what your future might be. So try to prevent this from happening. This is what I believe, honestly.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. J. Edwin Moses, he is an assistant professor from southern part of India, Bishop Harbour College. His question is, can you comment on the influence of Italian landscape on Shelley? Shelley means P.B. Shelley and his work.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. The Italian landscape, and most of all the landscape of Rome, was very important in the creation, for example, of Prometheus Unbound. If you happen to go to Rome, and hopefully you will, in the Spanish Steps, which is in the very center of Rome, there is a house that used to be Keats' house, and now hosts a museum. And the museum is called the Keats and Shelley Memorial House. And in the Keats and Shelley Memorial House, there is a very, very famous painting by Joseph Severn, which depicts Percy Shelley, and the features of Percy Shelley are always the features of Amelia Curran, in the baths of Caracalla. So with the ruins, surrounded by the ruins, writing Prometheus Unbound. So the atmosphere of Rome, the atmosphere of the fusion, what Percy Shelley was mesmerized at was the fusion between the ruins and nature. Because obviously now the situation is different, but in those days, the ancient ruins and the bushes and the grass, they were merged together. And this is what actually mesmerized Percy Shelley. So the influence of the Italian landscape is particularly visible in the Prometheus Unbound, and also in some of the poems that he wrote when he was in Italy. But he was also impressed by the Italian political situation. He wrote, for example, some odes on the Italian riots of the 1820-1821. So he was also involved in the Italian political situation, but he did not consider the Italians fit for self-rule. In his opinion, they were too lazy, too, slow-moving, too, they were too used to being dominated to properly rebel. And obviously Mary Shelley did not share his view.
I would like to also inform the participants that ma'am has also worked on the Partition of India. She has published a book called The Partition of India Beyond Improbable Lines. And I'm saying this to the participants, ma'am, because there are a lot of participants who are working on Partition of India, including me, who I have also worked during my MPhil dissertation on Partition of India.
Interesting.
So yeah, so this is very interesting for us to see that you have worked on the Partition of India, which is great. Did you work, like, can you just share some light on this book? What exactly angle did you focus on, like Western Partition, Eastern Partition of India?
No, I focused especially on the Southern Partition, Bengal Partition. Oh. And this is a collection of essays, in actual fact. And they focus on cinema, they focus on short stories, on novels. So there are different angles. And I hope that some of you will find interesting prompts in that.
Yeah, because there are participants here who are working on Bengal Partition. And
interesting.
Yes, yesterday we had a lecture in the evening on Bengal Partition narrative. And memoirs,
wonderful.
Yes. So,
wonderful.
from that perspective.
And I don't know, maybe you should look, I don't know whether you are familiar with this collection of story, which is a collection, oh my God, I can't remember her name now. She's a Scottish Indian writer. Debjani, not Debjani Chatterjee.
Okay.
Well, it will come to my mind. Bashabi Fraser.
Yeah, Bashabi Fraser. Yeah.
Yes.
Bashabi Fraser.
And she collected those stories, and it's a wonderful book.
Yeah. And she has worked a lot on Rabindranath Tagore as well. And
Bashabi
Fraser is associated with one of our generals also. She is in the editorial board.
Wonderful. Oh, great. She's a good friend of mine.
Yes, ma'am. A very humble person like you only. The next question, one more interesting question. And as you talked about the visit of Naples and Italy, I have a question from there. Dr. Amod Kumar Rai from the eastern part of India, Uttar Pradesh, he is an assistant professor. His question is, your comprehensive elaboration of the locale of Naples once again reminded me of one of my apprehension. Why Shelley wrote a poem with full of pessimism in background of the scenic beauty of Naples. Even in my last visit there in 2018, I was more perturbed by such an apprehension.
I couldn't grasp the question, actually.
The question is, Dr. Amod Kumar Rai had visited Naples in 2018 because of a conference, to participate in a conference. And when he visited Naples, he was awestruck with the scenic beauty. It was very beautiful. So he had an apprehension in mind, seeing the beauty of Naples. The apprehension was that in spite of Naples being so beautiful, why did Shelley write a poem full of pessimism?
Well, for the very reason that for him there was this fracture between the beauty of the scenery and the people. Because for him, the people were all rascals, they were all bandits, and in actual fact, he had a very rough time in Naples. They almost shot him. This is an episode in Shelley's life that is not known by everybody, but he had a very rough time. Naples is also associated to another episode in both Shelley's life, which is still a mystery. You probably don't know that when they were in Naples in December 1818, the Shelleys adopted an Italian child, Elena Adelaide. She was adopted, but they left her in Naples. Okay, so this is very strange. So there were a lot of conjectures on this, and there still are. Probably this girl, this Elena Adelaide, was not Italian, and probably she was the daughter that Percy Shelley had from Claire Clairmont. And they left this girl in the custody of an Italian family, but far away from where they were, because Mary Shelley didn't want Claire to interfere too much in their lives. So this is still a mystery. So probably this is the reason why there are a lot of mixed feelings by Shelley towards Naples.
As I informed you earlier, ma'am, that both the Shelleys enjoy a lot of space in Indian academia. And one of the poems by Percy Shelley, Ode to West Wind, is almost prescribed in all the courses in India.
Yeah,
Yeah,
wonderful.
it is everywhere. In every course, every university has it. That is Ode to the West Wind.
Fantastic.
Now,
Fantastic.
pertaining to that, Ode to the West Wind, I have a budding young research scholar from the southern part of India, that is University of Kerala. And her name is Sharada Devi, and her question is, can you speak about Ode to West Wind and its relation to Italy?
Okay. Ode to the West Wind, in my view, has virtually no relation to Italy, because this could be interpreted as Percy Shelley's response towards America. American independence, American freedom. So the west wind is actually the wind that comes from beyond the ocean. Okay, and probably he could appreciate even more this idea of freedom, unbounded freedom, because he was living in a country, Italy, that was dominated by everybody. Because as you know, when the Shelleys were there, Italy was divided into different kingdoms, let's put it in this way. One was dominated by the Austrian, another one was dominated by Leopoldo di Toscana, the Tuscany, another one was dominated by the Pope. So Italy was dominated by a lot of tyrants. And probably there is this kind of influence, the idea of domination clashing against this west wind, the promise of freedom and liberation from beyond the ocean.
Ma'am, one more question from the southern part of India, and
Yes,
she is also a PhD research scholar from the Department of Women's Studies, University of Madras,
yes.
Swithil Ramachandran. Her question is, can you please outline the influence of religious instability and the influence of other movements like Methodism in Italy on the Shelleys?
Okay, Italy is a solidly Catholic country, even now. So virtually there were no other, well, now it is slightly changing because people are diverting towards other religions. But in those days, Italy was solidly Catholic. And especially in the pontifical state, where Mary Shelley spent a lot of time with Percy Shelley, so Rome, the Rome area, everybody was absolutely Catholic. And for Percy Shelley, he was not, I would contest the fact that Percy Shelley was an atheist. He was not really an atheist because he believed in solidarity. This is what he believed. He didn't believe in the fact that men were good, because in his opinion, men were not good inside. But he believed that this evil could be overcome by helping other people, by establishing bonds of solidarity. But he hated this kind of Catholicism. I give you some instances of the way Catholicism was widespread in Italy in those days. Even where there were epidemics and malaria and pestilence, you know, people used to gather in churches. And obviously, this was terrible, because churches were the places where people used to contract the viruses and the epidemics and whatever. But they were so religious, and they were so encouraged to pursue religion and to stick to all the rituals of religion, that their health was not important. So he hated this kind of bigotry. This is what really Percy Shelley went against. Processions, for example, religious processions, Easter processions. There were a lot of people, and even when there was malaria, because malaria was endemic in the Rome area, starting from April till the whole summer, people used to get sick and die, but this did not prevent people from joining churches, joining processions, and spreading the disease. Not just malaria, but flus, all sorts of epidemics. So this is what Percy Shelley absolutely hated. But in Italy in those days, religions that were not Catholic were really, really rare. So the influence was Catholicism.
Thank you, ma'am. A question from a research scholar, Mr. Robert G. Pinar. He is a research scholar in Late Normal University, Philippines.
Philippines.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We have some ma'am,
That's wonderful. It's really
yes.
international.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We have scholars from Pakistan, from Bhutan, from Philippines, from South Africa, from Belgium.
Fantastic. I'm
Yes,
so happy.
we are also honored to have you, ma'am. His question is, can we consider the two Shelleys as romantics or realists?
Okay, now, first of all, these are labels that we put on writers. So they did not think of themselves as romantics. They did not think of themselves as realists. In those days, there were some schools, and this is something that I always highlight to my students, because my students always want to put the writers in boxes. Okay, this is pre-romantic, this is romantic, and I keep telling them, you can't do that, because they didn't know they were romantics. This is what we do to classify them for our own sake, not for their sake. But there were some schools in those days. There was the London School, the Cockney School, and Leigh Hunt and John Keith belonged to that. The Lake School, Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then there was the so-called Satanic School. Satanic, but just because those were writers that tried to go off the beaten track. They tried to explore new avenues. And Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley belonged to that. So I wouldn't speak about romantic, I wouldn't speak about realist, but if you want to classify them the way they themselves classify themselves. So belonging to the Satanic school, but Satanic not because they were messing with the underworld, but just because they violated, they crossed boundaries. This is what they used to do. physical and also ethical or scientific or any boundary, they crossed it. Think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, and this novel reflects very deeply the kind of scientific debate in those days and the way the scientists were trying to cross boundaries, discovering the essence of life.
Very well explained, ma'am. Thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
And now you had a section talking about, Shelley avoiding the women because of the garlic smell or a lot of garlic that the Italian. So pertaining to that garlic, we have a very interesting question. This is why Meenakshi Verma, she is an access consciousness practitioner.
Mhm.
And her question is, did this fact of avoiding garlic smelling women had some other implication too, apart from the olfactory reason, like an apprehensive association with vampires, witchcraft, or something like that?
No, 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 no. No, not in the list. Not in the list. Basically, the vampire fiction and garlic, this association was developed later on in the 19th century. If you think of the vampires up until the period of Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley, if you think of vampire stories, think of Carmilla by Le Fanu, think of Geraldine in Christabel by Coleridge. There is no mention of garlic. So this belongs to later vampire stories. Now, garlic was regarded by Shelley just something very unpleasant and connected with the diet of poor people. Obviously, they ate garlic also because for health reasons, because obviously they were not rich enough, and sometimes they used to eat food which was not properly preserved. And garlic was considered to be some kind of antiseptic, so it would kill the germs. And this is why they used to consume a lot of garlic. So Percy Shelley, on the one hand, he embraced people, but on the other hand, he was really aristocratic. He had blue blood. His father was a sir, okay? So garlic was associated with the lowest strata of people, and that's why he didn't like it.
Even the question answer session is also so enlightening and enriching. Thank you for sparing your time, ma'am. The last
Thank you.
question I will take by Falguni. Falguni's question, she is from Gujarat, that is the western part of India. And
Yeah. I was in Gujarat 1
wow.
year and a half ago in Surat.
So her question is, do you see Mary Shelley as a feminine Anglo-Italian enlightened traveler and Byron as a masculine Anglo-Italian enlightened traveler?
Okay. For sure, Mary Shelley has a feminine perspective, and she very much drew from her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. So she does not just delve into the political situation of Italy, but also in the cause of women's emancipation. So there are hints of the Italian cause for women's emancipation also in her travelogue. But yes, for sure, maybe the difference between Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley in terms of gender is the fact that Mary Shelley is more sympathetic towards the Italian people. There is more empathy, more sympathy towards the Italian, which is more feminine, okay? Whereas Percy Shelley is more detached, more aristocratic, and even though he speaks against the tyrants, he considers himself as higher above, whereas Mary Shelley doesn't. So this is the real difference. But yes, I would agree with this kind of separation between the two of them.
You know, ma'am, Italy has a very deep connection in our hearts, right from our father's time. The greatest, in our India, we have an industry called the Bollywood film industry. In
Mm-hmm.
Bollywood film industry, depiction of Rome is very romantic, and we have some of the best songs being shot in Rome right from
Really?
1970s.
Wow.
with that boat and somebody rowing that boat and the hero heroine sitting and singing very famous songs. So, and Italy has a special place for me because I am associated with Don Bosco University, and Don
Oh,
Bosco
wonderful.
starts from Italy. The journey of Don Bosco starts from Italy. So thank you, ma'am. On behalf of entire team Gnosis, it was an absolute honor and pleasure to have you
Thank
today.
you.
And I am sure the participants have hugely benefited. And I'm very excited because most of the participants are teachers. And I informed you earlier also that Shelleys, both the Shelleys, occupy a very important place in the academia of our country as well as the Indian subcontinent. So
I'm
this
really glad.
lecture will definitely add a lot of enrichment to their lectures, and thereby, and there are many students also, including my Don Bosco students who have joined, who are reading Shelley. And ma'am,
Wonderful.
your lecture was a thoroughly enjoyable one. The way you presented, an enriching one. The facts that you spoke
Thank you so much.
truly, without doubt, leaves you to be one of the great experts of these two writers. And thank you. It was an absolute honor to have you, and hope for such future associations too, ma'am. It was an absolute pleasure. We will definitely
Thank you.
keep in touch. Take very good care of yourself. We are really worried about Italy. Now I think Italy is in a better shape,
We are getting better at the moment.
but we
We
Indians
are
are getting,
reopening, so
but our
the
condition is not going good now. We are almost now 2 lakhs,
yeah.
200,000 now. Yes,
Wow.
infected. So pray for us. We will pray for you. Thank
I
you
will
very much for
definitely.
joining us. It was an absolute pleasure.
I am leaving you now in the chat my email address. So
Yes,
if you want to keep in touch, or if you want
we will
to, I mean,
definitely. It would be a
ask
great
other
honor and pleasure.
questions,
And
I'm
one more, ma'am. In this series, what we do is the questions which are asked, I will mail the questions to you. And at
yeah.
your free time, you can write the answers, and we will publish it in our journal in the forthcoming issues, which will be online available for everybody to read. And I think that will
Wonderful,
help.
wonderful. Okay,
Thank you
it's
so
been an
much, ma'am.
absolute pleasure. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so
Namaskar
much.
from India, ma'am. Please do take care.
Namaskar. Bye bye.
Bye.